Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Talking to the Void. I hope you all are doing well. Today, I wanted to talk about morally gray characters. I feel like there was a period of time within, I think, the late 2010s where everybody was drooling over morally gray characters, and today I want to unpack what it means to be a morally gray character, examples in media, why we like them, and what it means in a larger social context. If that sounds like a good time to you, then stick around. From this point forward, it's basically going to be unscripted. I'm going to have my list of points here with me, but otherwise, it's time for me to ramble to the void. Here we go. So, firstly, what does it mean to be a morally gray character? My understanding is that a morally gray character is not fully or 100% good or bad. And I feel like something that's not talked about enough when it comes to morally gray characters is that there are different shades of gray. There's different types of morally gray characters. And by that I just mean that, if you will, the lighter shades of gray are the characters who are morally gray but lean more towards being good, and the darker gray is leaning more towards being bad. And of course this can change during their character's development, and obviously you want to see the characters evolve, and so it's usually changing somewhere within that scale of gray that the character evolves, if that makes sense. Another way I like to think about it is in terms of D&D alignment charts. So as an example, I feel like honestly the entirety of the D&D alignments, well, okay, maybe not the entirety, but for a lot of the D&D alignments can be compared to the morally gray characters, even going so far as to say like chaotic good falls within the morally gray spectrum, and I would say chaotic evil might as well. I feel like true good, true evil, lawful good, and lawful evil don't fall into the category of morally gray so much. Feel free to politely disagree with me in the comments on any of the points that I make. But I would say that for the most part, the morally gray characters fall somewhere between, say, chaotic good to chaotic evil, excluding lawful and true evil, if that makes sense. I would say that a very common, I feel like the most medium shade of gray, if you will, or true neutral, is somebody who does whatever benefits them most, so they're self-serving. And that can seem evil, but if they're truly neutral, as in they only do things that benefit them, I would argue that is fully neutral, because they're not doing things because they're evil, they're not doing things because they're good, they're just doing whatever serves them. And let's see. I would say that another thing that defines morally gray characters is that they make some choices that are seen as good, quote unquote, and some that are seen as, quote unquote, bad. They essentially toe the line between heroism and villainy, kind of similar to an anti-hero, but not quite the same thing either. So what are some examples of morally gray characters? For the record, I did Google some examples of morally gray characters because my media consumption is fairly specific, and I wanted some examples that were maybe a little more mainstream, if you will, better known than some of the niche things that I watch that I could reference. So, as an example of a morally gray character, we have Walter White from Breaking Bad. I almost said Baking Bad. That would be a wild spin-off, wouldn't it? But Walter White from Breaking Bad. And he's considered a morally gray character because what he's doing, like, yes, he's making and selling meth, bad, because, you know, people overdose and stuff and die from drugs, so bad, right? Well, he's doing it for, if you will, quote unquote, the right reason, or a nice or kind reason. Essentially, he just wants to make money so that after he's gone, his wife and child have something to sustain them. So, example of a morally gray character. Another example that I can't really speak to is Jaime Lannister from Game of Thrones. I have not seen Game of Thrones. I don't intend to watch Game of Thrones. I can fully respect why people like that show, but honestly, it's not my cup of tea. So I don't know really who he is. I know the name, but I guess he's an example of a morally gray character. I would say that Max from the Mad Max movies is a good example of a morally gray character. I feel like he falls somewhere around true neutral from my understanding, and that, like, I would say he's slightly valenced more towards good, but generally when he goes along with other people, it's because he gains something out of it, and so he's doing what serves him, and so for that reason I kind of consider him to be true neutral. I would say that the BBC version specifically of Sherlock Holmes, played by Benedict Cumberbatch, is probably another good example of a morally gray character, because he definitely does some, at the very least, questionable things along the way. And so I would consider him to be morally gray. He does some good things, some bad things, some things that are not strictly good or bad, but fall outside of being strictly good or bad, if that makes sense. And, sometimes he does the wrong things for the right reasons, and vice versa. For very similar reasons, I have the Doctor from Doctor Who on here. I'm not thinking of any specific incarnation. I would say that various incarnations of the Doctor fall closer to the good side of the morally gray spectrum, and some fall a little bit closer to, say, the bad side of the morally gray spectrum. But I would say that overall, all of the incarnations of the Doctor hover somewhere around being morally gray, especially with everything, including the Ninth Doctor and beyond, because of the destruction of Gallifrey and the whole war and the Time War and everything. I would say that kind of brought about more, more examples of how the character is morally gray. Moving on, I would say Loki's another example of a morally gray character, and he's a good example of a character that shifts somewhere on the morally gray spectrum. I would argue that he starts out more, if we go from the very beginning of the very first Thor movie, he starts out on the good side of the morally gray spectrum, and then by the end of the first Thor movie, talking Marvel by the way, he kind of is on the darker side of the morally gray spectrum, and I would say that fluctuates throughout every movie that he's in. And I would say that overall, if we talk about the main timeline Loki, not the one from the TV series, I would say that he ends up more on the good side of the morally gray spectrum at the moment that he's killed by Thanos in Infinity War. Then I would say, oh gosh, I realized that I didn't put a spoiler warning. I guess because I forgot that I'm talking about several different kinds of media. Well, if I mention a character from a show that you have not seen or a movie that you have not seen that you intend to see, here is your belated spoiler warning, and I'm sorry if I spoiled something for you that you didn't already know. I figured most of the media that I'm talking about has been out for a hot minute, and so you've probably seen it if you were going to see it. If you haven't, I am truly sorry. I should have put a spoiler warning, but we're a little too deep into it, so we're just gonna keep going. Finally, the last example. Oh, let me actually talk about separate timeline Loki from the TV series. I would say that because he starts out as a variant of the one at the end of the first Avengers movie, I would say he falls more towards the darker shades of gray on the morally gray spectrum, but as the series progresses, he ends up on the good side of it. And I don't know if I would go so far as to say that he's off of the morally gray spectrum by the end of the series, but I think that could be debated. I think I could personally argue that he's no longer on the morally gray spectrum as of the end of the Loki series, but without spoiling that, I will leave you to watch it and draw your own conclusions. And finally, the last example of a morally gray character that I have is Bucky Barnes, and I kind of debated this one because as the Winter Soldier, he's not really him. He's not in control. But he does bad things as the Winter Soldier. So this one's kind of debatable, honestly. I could argue either way. I would say that there are some things that he does when he's in control that would be considered morally gray, but again, I will leave you to draw your own conclusions about that one. And now I actually want to talk about examples of characters that may seem morally gray but aren't, and I will give my reasons for why I don't think they're actually morally gray. I'm going to say the phrase morally gray and the word gray so much throughout the entirety of this episode, so if you get sick and tired of that phrase and the word gray by the end, I am sorry. Alright, examples of characters that may seem morally gray but aren't. First on the list, because I was kind of on a Marvel kick, is Thanos. He's doing the wrong thing that is, killing half the people in the universe, for the right reasons in a sense. He's trying to do something good, but he's still doing the wrong thing. And I would argue that the choices that he makes throughout the Infinity War films are not a combination of choices that are good and bad. He just consistently makes bad choices or morally bad decisions in order to do the quote-unquote right thing in his mind. So because there's not a combination of good and bad actions, in my opinion, I would say he's not morally gray. Just to go in a completely other direction, Hades, not from any specific thing, but just in Greek mythology, I would argue is on the morally gray, not the morally gray spectrum, because he didn't make a combination of good and bad choices. He was painted as the villain because he was associated with death and everything. And I would say that he didn't really do anything particularly good either. I would say that if anything, he probably lands smack dab in the middle on the true neutral kind of alignment, if we're going to talk D&D alignments, because they're helpful for this. Because he had a clear code and stuff, and I don't recall personally, from my understanding of Greek mythology, any instances where he was just extremely unfair to anybody. Granted, different retellings will tell you different things, but this is my personal understanding of Greek mythology Hades from the source material that I've read. Yet another example that I would say is a character that seems morally gray but isn't is Maleficent. I'm not talking about from the original Sleeping Beauty. I'm talking about from the 2014 movie Maleficent and then its sequel, which I think came out in 2019? ? I genuinely don't remember at this point. It's been a hot minute. But anyway, the two Maleficent movies, that's the Maleficent that I'm specifically talking about. So I don't think she's morally gray because she made a singular bad choice, in my opinion, that bad choice being cursing Aurora. That was a morally bad thing to do because Aurora had done nothing wrong, but she wanted her revenge and she went about it in a not great way. But after making that singular bad choice, she more or less spent the rest of the movie regretting, eventually, and trying to fix this bad decision that she made. And a singular bad choice does not make somebody a morally gray character. That, at least in my opinion. If you are overall a good or neutral character, and you make a singular bad choice, that does not make you morally gray. Moral grayness is a pattern, if you will. A pattern of choosing consistently between right and wrong. Not consistently always choosing good and not consistently always choosing bad. If you slip up once in the entirety of your character arc, that does not make you morally gray. That is my opinion, at least. And finally, last on the list, again, I'm not referencing any specific iteration of this, but Robin Hood, more in concept than any specific portrayal, is not morally gray, despite some arguments that I've seen that he is, and that's because he does something that is seen by society as bad, that is, stealing, something that is against the law, but he does it to help people. He's doing the wrong thing for the right reasons. And the thing is, I would argue that stealing is not necessarily morally wrong, especially in this context, and so therefore he's not morally gray. I would say he's morally good, because he's doing things to help people. He comes from a place of wanting to help, and so that's why I would say that he's not morally gray. Yeah, and so let me go ahead and talk about why we like morally gray characters, because I found this fascinating, and I actually kind of gained some insight into my own psyche while analyzing this, so I thought that was interesting. I think that we really like morally gray characters, generally speaking, because they tend to be more relatable than strictly good and strictly bad characters, because we as humans are imperfect. We are never going to be consistently good or consistently bad. For the most part. I can think of a few exceptions to the rule, generally speaking, but for the most part, we're not strictly good or bad. It's a spectrum, and because we see the characters' imperfections in morally gray characters, we identify with them. We go, oh, this person's not perfect either. They also make mistakes. I get that. And similarly, morally gray characters tend to be more nuanced and more interesting because they are not the same thing over and over again. There's variety to their actions because they're not always going to choose the good thing. They're not always going to choose the bad thing. they sometimes choose good and sometimes choose bad, and that just is more nuanced than consistently choosing good or consistently choosing bad, and that makes it more interesting as a viewer or consumer of whatever media this character is in. And again, because they don't always choose the consistently good or bad things, they're unpredictable. And again, that keeps things interesting. It's variety. Because they're unpredictable, you don't know what they're going to do next, and we like the novelty of that. We like to see where they're going to go. I would also argue that they inherently have more room for character growth, generally speaking, than a strictly good or strictly evil character, because the flexibility is built into their character with them being morally gray. To change a strictly good character into a bad or less good character, and vice versa, you have to break their worldview that leads them to be strictly good or bad, and that takes more work than it does with a character who already lives in this gray area. Because when they live in this gray area, good and bad are already obvious choices to them. Like, it's obvious that they have two options, good or bad, whereas the strictly good or strictly bad people are going to consistently choose the same thing, until they have a reason not to. But the morally gray characters don't need a reason to choose just one thing or the other. It's just kind of whatever makes sense with the way their character's written, if you follow me. And finally, I would say that morally gray characters are sometimes easier to root for because we want to see them find their way. I feel like a lot of them tend to be lost in some way or other, and that is why they are morally gray. They don't have any, this is not always true, of course, but they don't necessarily have a strict code that guides them to be good or bad, and that's why they live in this gray area. And with these characters, not always, but often, being lost in some way, I think that's something a lot of us can identify with. At least I personally can. Because somebody who's already strictly good or bad already has a set path because of their morals and ideals, while somebody who's gray tends to fluctuate within that. They don't have as much of a set path a lot of the time. And so because they don't have a set path, they can feel somewhat lost, and that's why they make some of the decisions they do. And I think that's why we can relate to that, or at least I personally can. And finally, I want to talk about, what does this mean societally or culturally that we tend to like morally gray characters? Why are they important? And so I would say that we recognize that everybody in this world contains a little good and bad in them, and the question is which side we lean to more, or if we choose to walk a path directly in the middle. Again, I could say that just about every human on this planet is morally gray. Again, all in varying shades of gray, because you're going to have people who lean more heavily to being good or towards being bad. But I would say that we all exist within this spectrum, and that is why it's easier for us to identify with morally gray characters and say a paragon of virtue, you know? Not that you can't love those characters, obviously. I can think of examples of characters who are not on the morally gray spectrum, who are good or bad, that I do like. But I think in terms of relatability, morally gray characters tend to be easier to relate to. And I would say that, you know, it's paradoxically cynical and hopeful, this idea of morally gray characters and moral grayness, because morally gray characters have often been jaded in some way and tend to be cynical about certain aspects of their lives, and I'm sure we've all experienced cynicism about something in the world that we live in, be it politics, the climate crisis, the general state of the world, etc. However, there is something hopeful in morally gray characters because of their flexibility and their innate capacity to grow and evolve, since they are not of a fixed alignment, generally speaking. I would say True Neutral might be an exception to this. So in this weird way, we have this mix of cynicism because they've been jaded. They see that the world is not black and white, and that, you know, there is bad in the world, but there is also good in the world, and where do you fit into that? But it's also really hopeful, despite being cynical, because there's room to grow, there's room to change. And so it's this bizarre combination of realism and hope in spite of reality, I think, that we, or at least I personally, tend to cling to and identify with in morally gray characters, which is what makes them appealing to us a lot of times. So, yeah, that is my, I guess, ramble about morally gray characters. I hope you enjoyed it, found it entertaining, possibly enlightening. Please make sure that if you haven't already liked the video and subscribed to my channel that you do so. Make sure you also ring the bell icon. You click on that bell icon so that you have notifications so you don't miss any of my posts or uploads. And yeah, thank you again so much for listening, and I'm sending you all the love.